As with most spiritual truths, we are given an everyday life event or example to help us see and understand what is needed in our lives, to help us and to help others. It is an individual walk and journey without a defined one-size-fits-all solution. There is only one one-size-fits-all solution, Jesus.
Our metaphor today is Stop the Bleeding, which was taken from a recent message by Pastor Chris Hodges from the Church of the Highlands. It is such a perfect example that we want to continue our topic of being ready with your finances with this analogy. While we will use Stop the Bleeding concerning finances and debt, this same metaphor can be used when talking about love, marriage, preparing for retirement, and even preparing for death.
In today's podcast, we want to bring tangible light to areas in life that need the Word and Spirit of God through the wisdom of teaching and personal testimony to stop the bleeding. Join us today as we look into being ready and stopping the bleeding.
Hi, Jana. I hope you're doing well.
It's been a while.
It has been a while for us.
It has. So those of you listening won't know this because we've been recording or releasing episodes along the way, but my family recently got back from a 10-day Disney World trip, so we didn't do any recording during that time. So we're a little rusty today. It's been about 2 weeks since we've recorded.
I'm rusty most days, Jana, but I make it through. I know that on our last podcast, we touched on some information that Pastor Chris Hodges gave that you had written down that really touched your heart. And I'd kind of like to start this off where we ended on the financial part and talk a little bit about that before we move into the other areas today.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Yeah, so as we were kind of preparing and building out outlines for our different episodes, we both listened to Church of the Highlands messages, and it just so happened it perfectly aligned with what they were talking about, with what we were talking about. And so the two that really came to my mind it was something about the numbers, and then the last one was the way out of this mess. And one, I love that message title because I think so many of us feel like we're in a mess in some phase of our life, whether that's with your finances, with a relationship, with your job, with your kids. I mean, man, there's so many areas that can be a mess. And so I thought he gave a really good framework with how the way out of the mess, particularly with your finances. And so I did want to touch on some of those things. So to kind of wrap up our talk on finances, because our last episode was really heavy about that, I provided some resource links in the show notes of that episode. But if it is something that was really speaking to you or was meaningful to you, I thought he did a really good job of making it very simple. And he had a very simple framework for the way out of the mess. And in this episode, in the description, I will be sure to link his sermon on this topic. And if it's something you're interested in, definitely go check that out. But I'm paraphrasing his basic framework, but these were really the 5 steps that he suggested for the way out of the mess. Number 1 was to stop the bleeding. 2 is to create margin. 3 is to build savings and avoid new debt. 4 is to pray for help and guidance. And 5 is to give generously. And I think we're really going to hit on that last component. We didn't touch on that much in the last episode. That was an area we wanted to do a little bit more discussion around today. Mm-hmm. He also shared a money covenant that he and his wife created for themselves. And I thought that was really inspiring. Jordan and I, we don't have like a defined covenant, but we do have a practice of budgeting once a month, and we do have shared money goals. And I would encourage those of you who are married, I know that was something that once we started to do that together, it really strengthened our relationship and our marriage. So if you're not doing those things, I would encourage you. It can be uncomfortable at first, but I would encourage you to start having those discussions and to try to get on the same page. And whether that's a meeting once a month, maybe you can even go out to dinner, make it something fun, we really do enjoy it now. It's one of our favorite things that we do together, I think, is kind of looking and preparing and planning for finances and the benefits that that can have over time. So, anyways, Chris Hodges, his money covenant that he shares with his wife is this: that God owns everything, not just 10%. Tithe to a local church first and make it holy. Avoid debt so God's money doesn't go to the wrong place. Never spend more than we make, and be generous on every occasion. Ultimately, to live an open handed life. And I really liked that last
Mm.
part. I just found that really inspiring. It's definitely, Jordan and I aren't near on this level, but one day I would like to be. I would like to get stronger in those areas of faith. So to me, it was inspiring, and I hope it will inspire some others out there as well. One of the verses that he mentioned is one of my favorite verses. This is actually something that I think about when I'm about to make a large purchase, and sometimes it can help me to prevent making that purchase.
Mm.
But it's Matthew 6:19-21. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Yes.
And so to me, that's just a really good one to call on when you're about to make a purchase, because that is true. You have a set amount of resource, and you can either save that money, you can spend it, or you can give it. And trying to think about which bucket that falls in, trying to think about your heart, and is this what you would ultimately, does it co-align or does it correlate to your values? And so this is a verse that I repeatedly come back to when I'm making a larger purchase, for example.
There was a word that you used when you were talking, and it said holy, HOLY. And some people may not know what that is. But I think you do. I just don't think you broke it down, because a marriage ceremony is considered holy matrimony. It's different from any other thing. Your relationship with God is different. It's holy. There is no other relationship like the one you have with God. There is no other relationship. There's a holy relationship between you and your partner. There's a holy relationship between you and your children. So holy, it means set aside, completely different. And then talking about finances and talking about offerings, it reminds me of the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. Would you like to touch on that now?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, well, there's no better place than to go back to the beginning. And Genesis 4 gives us the story of the first brothers. And Abel took care of the flocks while Cain cultivated the ground. At the designated time, and that's a loaded phrase. I think we could do an entire podcast series on at the designated time. So, whatever that is, Cain brought some of the fruit of the ground for an offering to the Lord. So, Cain's giving an offering to the Lord. Somehow he must have known he should have done that. Either there was a conversation with Cain, Adam and Eve talked to him about it, but Cain knew he needed to give an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought some of the firstborn of his flock, even the fattest of them. There's a difference between the two, you can see right there. But you don't know what that difference is, but there is a difference, and it's almost a conflict.
Mm.
And the Lord was pleased with Abel and his offering, but with Cain and his offering he was not pleased. So Cain became very angry, and his expression was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why is your expression downcast? Is it not true that if you do what is right, you'll be fine? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it." And that was the conversation that God had with Cain. concerning an offering. What I see in this is the heart, which God always wants to get to. God is always after our heart, the hidden things in our heart. Not that He doesn't know them, He knows them already, but He wants us to know what's in our heart. And Abel just gave generously, and I believe out of his heart. And
Mhm.
I don't think Cain did. And obviously, there was something in Cain, because the next thing we hear from Cain is that he kills his brother.
Mm.
I think that when you become stingy and greedy and hold
Yeah, I
back,
was gonna say greedy. That's the
yeah,
word that really came to my mind.
greedy, and you withhold something, if God's given us everything, He's going to give us everything. You can't live willy nilly. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're talking about our finances, not going out there and buying everything.
Right.
But what's in the heart? And that greed and anger turned into murder.
Mm.
And
Yeah, the
may
jealousy too.
jealousy. And maybe that's what God wanted to deal with to begin with in the offering. The dealing with the heart, he was exposing to Cain what was in his heart. Because Abel, it was very obvious to see what was in his heart, and it was so much that it shed a bad light on Cain. Cain
Mm.
wasn't going to have it anymore. So those are, when we're talking about offerings, when we're talking about giving, it's the heart. And as you said in the scripture, where your treasure is, there your heart is also.
Yeah. This can be a tough one. I know it is for me. This is a tough area because I think that it's scary. It requires
Well,
a lot of faith. It
there's
requires a lot of faith to give 10% of what you bring in first to God or a local church. And I think a lot of people question that because I don't want to say they've been burned by their local church, but they may not have a very good experience with church. Um, I
well,
would say don't let bad experiences keep you from being a good, generous person.
you
You know,
you
if you had a bad experience with a church, try a different church. If you've had bad experiences with churches in the past, then find a different means for growing your spiritual community. I mean, we're doing that here now. And there's a lot of different ways that you can give and tithe and give your gifts and your best to God, I think.
and I also think that when you're starting out, God's just he's you're going to take baby steps. And when you give
Yeah.
an offering and you give your tithe, you're not giving it to that local group who may be misusing it, or that local group that isn't misusing it. That isn't the issue. Don't judge that at this moment. At this moment, obey. And if it gets to the point that God does not want you to put your tithe in a certain area, oh, He'll let you know. And He will let you know in no uncertain terms, and you won't really have to judge it. You'll just be uncomfortable. I was just thinking about this. And if you're married, your mate say, I was thinking about that too. And it's a journey. You may be called somewhere else. And as we said in the beginning, it's not a one size fits all. This is a journey. Some people grow faster than others. There's certain plants you put in the ground, and man, they grow like crazy. And there's others, it takes you a couple years before you get fruit from it.
Yeah.
And so God doesn't have a problem with that. What He
And
has a problem with is your heart.
and you've said some quotes throughout the years that have known you related to this topic that I find inspiring. One of those I wrote down, I had to find it for this episode, but you said at one point, well, I know you've said this one many times, you can't outgive God.
Mm-mm.
That's not one that I had to write down, but you can't outgive God, and I think that's true. But one of the other ones that I liked, that I thought was is really witty, is you said that God is the best insurance plan. God only asks for 10%, He covers everything, and there's no copay.
And that's
And
the
I just
truth.
like that because, I mean, we do. We pay a tremendous amount of our percentage to insurance.
We do.
So, and we just view that as a non-negotiable.
Oh,
And
and I mean, if we're going to talk about that, then what do you do? If you have a flood and you go to your insurance agent and they go, "Oh, you didn't have a flood policy." Well, God has a flood policy, and He covers storms, and He covers earthquakes, and He does all that because He's God. And I think you got to add a little humor to it sometimes too. I just do. I don't want to touch too deeply on this, but there is there's a little there's a little darkness in this Genesis 4. It's a little twilight zone. Do 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 do. And it said, sin is crouching at the door. Now, that has a feeling of an animal, of a predator. And we do have an enemy. Actually, the enemy hates God. And because we look like God, of course, he hates us. And God loves us so much, so he's after us. There is spiritual darkness. I love digging in this topic. And this is why I followed Dr. Michael Heiser and have read his Unseen Realm book and also took the class. But Jesus mentions it just briefly in Scripture, but he uses the word mammon. You can't serve God and mammon. Well, newer translations are going to have the word money, and it's Luke 16:10 through 13. And if you want to know what Jesus considers a successful person, I think it's summed up here. The one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And the one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you haven't been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you haven't been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. But a word that was used there before was mammon, and mammon was considered a god, a little g god, but nonetheless a god. And whether we want to get into some of that stuff, there's some forces that are after us, and they want our allegiance. The first commandment was, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Now, I'm quoting that in King James because that was one I learned years ago. If I go back to King James Version, then that means I learned that sometime in the 90s. And if I use a different translation that's more English based, then that means it's kind of new to me. But that was the first commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods, little g, before me. And it would imply that there are other things that want your attention, that are crouching and want to dominate you. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. You know, do your own research, do your own thinking about it. But there was a darkness that appeared in Genesis 4. It appeared before, but in Genesis 4 that wanted Cain, and it was successful.
Mm. Yeah, that is dark. That's not necessarily
No, it's not.
the
It's not,
happiest message to think about,
well,
but I wanna mention, because since you brought up the first commandment, in Matthew, it talks about the greatest commandment, and I think this is really to combat maybe the first commandment, to prevent you from worshiping other gods or putting other gods before gods, and the greatest commandment, Jesus said, was to love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind,
well,
which
if you do
is a
that,
tall ask.
well,
But if
yes,
you're
and if you
doing
do
that,
that,
then then you're not
If you
serving another god.
yes, exactly. If you're doing that, you're not serving another god. And also, I think the 10 Commandments, which ended up turning into 16, or it turned into 615 maybe laws and regulations. God said, look, they can't even get that. 10 is too many. Just do the two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Mhm.
And then what do we do to complicate it? We go, well, who's our neighbor? Who's our neighbor?
Reminds me of my, like, former students when I was a teacher. They always wanted to know what was on the test so they could prepare just for those specific questions. It's like you're always looking, you're kinda scheming. Like, "Okay, well, le if I can just do the bare minimum of work." Oh, man.
Well, and we wanna do that, and it's not just in the financial, it's in tithing, it's in offering, it's in loving somebody. How
Mhm.
often do I have to take them out on a date? How much money do I have to spend on them?
Yeah,
You
let's
know?
get into the topic of love.
Okay,
Shifted a sh
because I'm such an
Yep.
expert in this area, right? Oh, I'm a walking example of what not to do. Uh, but, the warm fuzzies, you wanna look in their eyes when they touch your hand, it just feels so good, and you think about them. You go to bed at night thinking about them. You wake up in the morning and you're thinking about them, and then, of course, what we say is that's falling in love, which, I don't think fall is a really good term,
Mm.
and then
I've never
mm,
thought about that saying, "Fall in
mm,
love."
mhm.
Hmm.
No, we need to walk in love.
Mm.
But it is a design. God designed man and women, and He said it wasn't good for man to be alone. And there's strength in that design. There is strength in that design. But we, of course, are flawed. And God wants to teach us more about Him again by walking in love. Not because we feel like it, but because we've made a commitment to it. And when you're falling in love, which is wonderful, I must say, it's really good. It's really, really good. But then there comes a time when, it's not too good. I'm going to give this analogy. When an eagle lays eggs, it makes this big nest. It does the foundation of it with these thorns and heavy branches. And then it gets soft stuff and packs it in. The eagle will even pluck feathers from itself and line the inside of that nest, lay its eggs. Nice, warm, soft. Oh gosh, you could sleep. And then the eggs hatch and the babies start getting bigger. And the mother starts taking the stuffing out of the nest. And the thorns hit. That's not comfortable. I don't like that. And then it gets to the point it's so uncomfortable, the eagle finally leaves the nest and flies.
Hmm.
And there comes a time in that beautiful love story where it's not very comfortable. And people will run or else they'll fly.
Hmm.
Fly together because the whole point is learning that you're stronger together than you are individually. And
Yeah,
it's
I
not
like that, and I think that that's very true, that you're stronger I think that's the whole intention behind marriage. Ultimately, you wanna be able to connect with someone who their strengths overcome your weaknesses and vice versa.
and vice versa. But we just only want their strengths. When the weaknesses show up, we're not too happy about those. Now, I was divorced longer than I was married. I was married for 17 years, and I was divorced longer than that. And I was trucking along happy, happy. I honestly have to tell you, I was happy. And in December of 2020, I realized I was in a new place in my life and I wanted direction. I went to a very dear friend that loves Jesus and had a talk with her. And she was talking to me and she said, "You will find love again." And I just ended the conversation. I was like, I didn't ask for that. And being my very good friend, she looked at me and pointed her finger. She said, "I don't care if you like it or not. You're going to find love again."
Mm.
And it was a 3-year process to get me to the point where I'd finally stand in my bedroom and say, "Okay, God, I give up." And it was because God said, "Marriage is my design. I designed it." And I remember speaking to him and I said, "You had to use that word design, didn't you? Because you see, I'm a designer. And I know the thought process, and when something's a really good design, it's just great." God said, "I designed it this way. This is my design. You have experienced the flaws, but I want to teach you the good." And that's when I met Tommy.
And I wanna dive into being ready for love, since this whole series is on being ready. What were some changes or some differences in yourself that you think prepared you to be more open to love this time around?
Um, I would run into couples that were older and they held hands. And they had these, I could tell from restaurants they were over there having a really good time enjoying each other. I also lived in Fairhope at the time, and I have a very good friend, Angeline. And Angeline just was persistent with, "You need to get married. You really need to get married. You need to find somebody." And Angeline and her husband, Kenny, have been married since out of high school. I mean, they dated in high school, and they've been together longer than they've been apart. And their marriage was such a good example. You and Jordan are a good example to me. And what God did was He put these examples in front of me to where I could see them and I could see the good. But I didn't have the faith. I just thought, well, that's for other people and it's not for me. And I basically had to be tricked by a friend into meeting Tommy. It was not to meet him because, hey, he's single and nice looking man. It was, you know, he's very handy to have around the house. And I go, "Ooh, I could use that. And especially for Aunt Mamie. Yeah, maybe I need to meet him." And and so I kind of tripped into it, which is, man, that could be a motto for me in my life. I just kind of tripped into things. But even after I met Tommy, and even after I could tell that this was something different, I had a breakdown. And I said, "I didn't ask for this. I really do not want to unsettle my life. I've gotten really comfortable right here, and I can deal with this right here. I didn't ask for this." And God again said, "This is my design. This is my purpose for you." And so, was I going to go my way or was I going to follow God? And that's really how it went for me.
I know for me, I am not a romantic person. I don't even the thought of really cheesy romantic stuff, just I don't care for it. I think that actually bodes really well for me with marriage. And I'm
Hmm.
also married to someone who is also not a romantic. So that works really well. But neither of us have ever really bought into the cheesy Hollywood version of love. And where I see a lot of people maybe go wrong is that they think that that's the way that love is supposed to be. But this ties into that's not really God's design.
Mm-mm.
That's Hollywood's design,
That's Hollywood.
and it's not real. And it while it makes a great movie, I love a rom-com. Love them. I don't want my life to be a rom-com. I view marriage and relationship goals as you choosing a person and you choose to be with that person every single day, like every
Mhm.
single day, we have the choice to stay married or to not. We have the choice to be with the person that we've chosen to be with. Ultimately, we do. Whether you believe that or not, you do ultimately have that choice. And I think it's really romantic that after all of these years, Jordan and I still wake up every day choosing to be with each other. And we're so happy with the choice that we've made. And that's my ultimate, like, I want us to continue to choose each other and to make each other better and stronger and to just continue to grow that love that we have for one another.
I think the relationship and the commitment is love
Yeah.
because God is committed to us and He is in a relationship with us, even when we're not that pretty, even when we are really messy. And again, when we decide that we're loving this person today, man, they are grumpy. I think I'm just going to leave. We can't do that because God never leaves us. It's another way of learning more about the heart of God, which is what His design is all about. It's all about that.
Yeah. So I have some friends in Oklahoma, and they recently started a podcast. I haven't gotten to listen to any episodes yet, but they shared a quote from their most recent podcast episode, I'm assuming, and I really liked it. And it says, "Love is not about finding the right person, but creating a right relationship. It's
Mm,
not about how much love you have in the beginning, but about how much love you build till the end." And
yes.
I loved that because I do think it is a journey, and it is something that evolves over time, and you just have to make an effort to grow it. When you stop putting in the effort into something, it's kind of like a house plant. I love to look at house plants. I hate to take care of house plants because what do you have to do? You have to invest in it over time. If you stop nourishing it, what happens? It withers up
Well,
and dies.
and you got to know what days you need to water it, and you need to pay attention to it to see it. There's all these things, and I was going to say what you mentioned that your friends with the podcast said. I was going to say, well, where do we see that in Hollywood? But there is one movie I can think of that in that Shadowlands, and it's about C.S. Lewis and his wife Joy, and it's a beautiful story. So if you'd like to watch a movie that kind of hits on the topic that we're talking about, I just recommend Shadowland
The
as an off-boat.
Shadowlands, is that what you said?
Shadowland, the
Yeah,
Shadowland.
I've never heard of it.
C.S. Lewis and his wife Joy,
Mm.
and Anthony Hopkins is in it. And the moment he decides to choose Joy and love her, he doesn't say a word, but you can see it. And probably that's one of the things that I noticed. I didn't have to go up to someone and say, "Are you guys in love?" Because it was obvious.
Mm.
And it's not a checklist like the 10 Commandments that open their door, follow them in, do this, do this, do this, because it's a commandment. It is something that just flows. And I think that that's the difference between Cain's offering and Abel's offering. It just flows. And when you find somebody like that, then commit to it. And not only that, when there are hard times, because Jesus said, in this world you will have troubles. He didn't say occasionally. He said, you will have trouble,
Yeah.
but I've overcome the world. So, look at what I did. Follow the example. But
And
when you
and
do,
mm,
don't talk about your mate and gossip
mm,
because that affects your heart and you harden your heart because of your words toward them. If you're having a bad day with your spouse, talk to God about them because God will soften your heart and He'll say, yeah, that's because in their childhood, blah, blah, blah. or that's because they've experienced rejection and they think you're rejecting them. There's all these things. And if you talk to God, it softens your heart. And also, don't make fun of them in public. If you go to church or you go to a restaurant or to an event and you're late, and when you get there, don't go, I'm sorry we're late. I just can't get him to do, or she's always late. That's picking, and it's not in a good way.
Yeah.
Stop it.
Yeah, and I think that in order to be prepared for love, you really have to love yourself before you can love someone else. I don't remember which movie it's from, but there's a quote that says, "You complete me," in a movie, and I think that that is a lie. Like, I don't think that you need to find your happiness or your completeness in another person. I really do think the design of marriage and the strength of marriage is that one doesn't complete the other, but you both make each other stronger. And when you both have a healthy relationship with yourselves first, and then you mesh into one, it just makes you stronger. It's really
Yeah.
hard to love and treat someone else with respect and do some of those things when you can't do that for yourself.
I think it's almost impossible to love if you can't see how loved you are by God already.
Mm.
If you do not, I know that some of the areas I got into trouble was that I didn't see my worth, and I was always constantly trying to prove myself because I didn't know that I was already loved. So I was out
Same,
searching for something I
same.
already had. And so there's that. And in Proverbs, which is wisdom literature, it tells us a three-chord strand is not easily broken. And that's you, your partner, and God in it. Because
Mhm.
there's three of you in the relationship, and it's not easily broken. The enemy's not going to get you. There's another
Well, it's like a
saying that says
tripod, you know,
it
like
is.
a tripod stand. You need the 3 legs in order to stand up because otherwise what happens? It it's unstable and it falls.
And I think that that can relate to finances. I think it can relate to looking forward to retirement and planning that. And I think it can also look to even preparing for death. I think it can relate to so many areas, and even in raising children. There's a saying that says, if you want to go far, go together.
Mm,
If you want to go fast, go alone. You're not going to go super fast because you're going to have to deal with the other person's personality and things, but you will go far. First Corinthians. Oh, man. I think most people who are married have used that. First Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love keeps no record of
mm,
wrong.
that's a big one.
That's a big one. That one, you always do this to me. That sounds like a record of wrong to me.
Yeah.
I've done it. I
Oh,
do
I'm
it.
so guilty of that one.
But God doesn't keep a record of our wrong, and He is love. So you want to be ready for love? You need to be ready to change your mindset, to repent and go in the opposite direction from what you were going in. Those things that we talked about in our first episodes of the podcast.
Mhm.
And then we had mentioned something about, I'd kind of like to wind it down. We mentioned something about retirement. And I always think of Proverbs and the wisdom in the Proverbs about the ant that stores up during harvest. So it has something to eat in the wintertime. What a great analogy. So is that retirement? I think we could use that analogy for that.
Mm,
I'm at an age that I have more years behind me than I have ahead of me. I am not going to be able to earn at my age and work like I did when I was younger or do what you're doing. So I need to really pay attention to my spending. I need to live within my means and realize that this is where I am, not from a woe is me. I don't need to have that mentality. I can do this. It's just I think it's just a wise
mhm.
analogy that I am not where I used to be. You and Jordan are in a different place. So y'all's vision for retirement is going to be a little different from mine.
Yeah, everybody's perspective is different. I would say for those young listeners out there, man, when you can start early, you can get a huge jump on retirement. Even just putting in $25, $50 a month can, with compounded interest, that can amass well into the millions.
Mm,
But if you're not someone younger, if you are older in life or you're coming upon those years of retirement, don't feel hopeless.
no.
There's always a way to use what you've been given and to utilize some resources to help develop a
Mm.
plan to be ready for that next phase of life.
I mentioned Proverbs. Proverbs 6 says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Observe her. Observe her ways to be wise. It has no commander or overseer or ruler, yet it would prepare its food in the summer. It gathered at the harvest what it will eat. How long, you sluggard, will you lie there? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to relax, and poverty will come like a robber, and your need like an armed man." Proverbs 20, verse 4 says, "The sluggard does not plow in the autumn. It will seek at harvest and have nothing." I've worked. That is something I did do. I love to work. I have been so blessed to do what I love to do. But it is wisdom that during the years that you can work, you should work and you should store up from the harvest. So that's really some of the advice I have on retirement. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but there are people that are. And if you're thinking about this, if this hits home with you, then seek out resources, seek out some ways to get help and get clarity. Now we're going to touch on everybody's favorite topic, and that is death. Jesus spoke about his death many times. He told his disciples and the people in the temple that he would die. But Jesus looked at Peter after he died and said, "Feed my sheep." One of the most important things that we can do is to make a way to help the young that are following us. That's our children, that's our grandchildren, that's the young people that are around us. Preparing for death can be speaking with a loved one and giving them direction and valuable teaching, something that's very important. Can you remember the last words that a loved one said to you? Does it bring you comfort? Is it a privilege to sit beside the bedside of someone who is passing and let them know you love them?
So both Jordan and I lost a parent in our 20s. And actually don't remember the exact conversation that my dad and I had as our last conversation. He passed when I was in Connecticut, and during that time frame of my life, I was commuting back and forth to work. And Jordan, as I mentioned on an earlier podcast, that was a really rough time in our relationship. He was very busy with work, and I just felt kind of lonely. And my dad was honestly the person who I sought out the most. And even before that in South Dakota, I had a long commute to work, to and from work. And so I would always call him on my commute. And my dad, he, I think not having Jordan and I around anymore, I think he just really was seeking conversation. I think he went from a time period of Jordan and I were always at my house. I mean, that is where we hung out. And so he was around us so much. And then when after we left and he and mom were empty nesters, I think it was really hard on him because he missed that communication and social interaction that we had together. And so, anyways, those commute conversations, they might end up turning into 3-hour conversations. And so I was able to talk to him so much in that time frame from about 2013 when we moved out to South Dakota. to 2017 when he passed. So that's a good 4 years of 2 3 hour long conversations very routinely. And so I look back on that and I'm really thankful for that time because I'm just really glad I had it. I don't remember the exact last conversation we had. I think it had something to do with, like, what's coming back to my memory. I remember where I was. I was sitting on the stairs of our townhome, and he had just undergone an operation, was about to go home, and he felt like he was doing better. He was really positive and really upbeat. I don't remember the exact words, but yeah, that's the last time I remember talking to him. And uh, oddly enough, I sort of had a similar situation with Beth. So I didn't get to, like you had mentioned, being beside somebody on their bedside as they're dying. I didn't get that with either my dad or my mother-in-law, because of distance and because of both of them being somewhat unexpected. So similarly, Beth had retired when we not long after. The time frame I can't remember exactly, so I might have this a bit off, but I think she was already retired when we moved out to South Dakota. And so if I wasn't talking to my dad, I was talking to Beth on my commute. And so I got to have those conversations with her too. And so again, even though I don't remember my last conversation with her, I felt like I had all of this time with them even though we were apart. And so I'm really thankful that God allowed me to have those moments, um, because I didn't get to see them very much in those last years.
I remember the last conversation I had with your dad, but I remember the days leading up to that. And Katie and I was in Colorado, and we just happened to be in town, and it was your nephew's birthday.
Mhm.
I was invited to go over, and I'm a photographer. I take pictures. And so we went down near a creek and we were doing individual family portraits. And your mom and your dad came down and they gathered and we did a family portrait. And that was the last photo of your dad.
Mhm.
And this was the first part of February, and he passed away on the 21st, correct?
Yes. Yeah,
And
and we had not had a family photo
mm-mm,
probably for years because Todd and Krista had moved away, and, then we had moved away, so that was, uh, gosh, I don't even remember what would have been the last family I guess probably my wedding was
mm.
probably our wedding, but
And so at the time, it didn't necessarily seem so important. I did think it
mhm.
was odd because I didn't think your mom and dad were gonna come down for that,
Yeah.
because your dad really wasn't in the best of health, and
No.
within the week, he had surgery. So I was back in Colorado, and I called the hospital room because I just wanted to check on him, and he answered the phone. And I spoke with him, and when we got off the phone, but when we were ending our conversation, he said, "I love you." And that was the first time he had ever said that to me.
Mm.
And I said, "I love you too." And I hung up the phone, and I remember standing and knowing that was a moment. I didn't know what the moment was, but I knew it was something. And
Y
so
y yeah.
I think looking back, of course, you want to say he was preparing himself.
Well, he also had a similar moment with, my granddad,
Oh,
and I've heard Granddad talk about it. The last time that they ever spoke, Dad put his arm around him, and I don't remember exactly what he said. I remember my granddad looking back on that and just thinking, like, it's almost like he knew somehow, like, it was an odd thing for him to say and to do.
and those are comforting moments, and we remember those. We've talked about being ready. I think this is a really good place to end our series on this. Of course, we could talk forever about it and tell stories about it, but I think this is a good place to end, and I'd like to close this in prayer.
Okay.
Lord, set us free from the things that do not bring us life. Give us wisdom and knowledge. Lord, you have provided the world with everything that is needed. Help us to take these gifts and have life, and to give to those that are in need. Share your abundance, and in so, we're giving life and healing those that are in need. Lord, help us to love those in our lives generously, especially our spouses. Help us to trust you in the suffering and realize in the suffering we meet you and learn things about you that we would never have known otherwise. We love you, Lord. You are worthy of our praise. You are worthy of our love. You are worthy of offerings. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. This episode will release on Easter weekend if my math is adding up correctly. So just want to let all of our listeners out there wish you a very happy Easter weekend, and I hope you're able to spend some time with your families and loved ones and celebrate a special weekend that it is.
Yeah, celebrate resurrection from death. That's definitely something to celebrate. Thank you to all those that listen. We really appreciate you listening in. It encourages us. It encourages us to continue. And we hope that you're learning something and that you're growing.
Yeah, because we are.
Yeah, that always happens when you teach. And so have a great
absolutely
week.
Does.
Yeah, have a great week, and we'll see you, or you can hear us very soon. Bye.
All right. We look forward to joining you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.